It was a chilly morning at Millstone Cafe, the kind of day where the hum of the coffee machines mixed with murmured conversations felt almost comforting. The air smelled of fresh brewed coffee, caramel, and the faint aroma of pastries just out of the oven. The small cafe was busy but not chaotic, with customers standing in line, reading newspapers, or quietly scrolling through their phones. Sunlight streamed in through the large glass windows, casting a golden glow on the wooden floors. Officer Bradley Carter, a regular at the cafe, leaned casually against the counter, waiting for his usual order, a double-shot espresso with extra cream. Bradley was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline that some might have found attractive if not for the permanent sneer etched across his face. His presence was hard to miss. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who thought the world owed him respect. Bradley was known around town, though not for the right reasons. He was a cop, but not the kind people admired. His reputation was built on arrogance, a quick temper, and an uncanny ability to make others feel small. People whispered about his sharp tongue and power-hungry attitude, but no one dared confront him. After all, he was a man with authority, a badge, and a loud voice that often silenced dissent. A woman stood a few feet away from him, unnoticed at first. She wasn't flashy or loud, her presence was quiet but oddly striking. She wore a plain gray jacket, jeans, and comfortable sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she held a small leather bag at her side. Everything about her seemed ordinary, yet there was something in the way she stood, calm, confident, composed, that made her different. She wasn't trying to stand out, but somehow, she did. "Excuse me, could you move?" she said, her voice steady but polite. She gestured toward the stack of napkins on the counter that Bradley was leaning against. Bradley turned his head slowly, almost as if it was an inconvenience to acknowledge her existence. He glanced at her, then turned back to the barista, ignoring her completely. "Excuse me," she repeated, this time a little louder. That's when he chuckled under his breath, a low, mocking sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Without looking at her, he muttered, "You people always act like you own the place." The words weren't loud, but they carried. The barista froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the coffee machine. A man sitting at a nearby table glanced up from his laptop, his expression one of discomfort. The air in the cafe seemed to shift, the warm, inviting atmosphere replaced by a cold tension. The woman paused, her hand still outstretched toward the napkins. She didn't flinch or react immediately. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her face calm and unreadable. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were sharp, observing everything: the sneer on Bradley's face, the way the barista avoided eye contact, and the awkward silence that had fallen over the room. She slowly pulled her hand back, clasping it lightly in front of her. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Her silence was deliberate, and it spoke louder than any words she could have said. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire cafe was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman, sitting with a toddler in a high chair, glanced at the door as if contemplating whether to leave. The man with the laptop coughed lightly, pretending to be focused on his screen, but his eyes kept darting toward the counter. Bradley, oblivious to the tension he'd created, smirked to himself. He enjoyed moments like these, moments where he could flex his authority, even in the smallest ways. To him, this woman was just another nobody. She didn't look like anyone important. No fancy clothes, no designer handbag, no air of importance. Just another face in the crowd, and to Bradley, that meant she didn't matter. "Excuse me, sir," the barista finally said, her voice hesitant. "Your coffee is ready." Bradley turned away from the woman without a second glance, grabbing his cup from the counter. He didn't bother thanking the barista, just took a long sip and leaned back against the counter, once again blocking access to the napkins. The woman stood there for a moment longer, her expression unchanged. She glanced at the napkins, then at Bradley, as if weighing her options. Finally, she stepped to the side, giving him a wide berth, and reached for a packet of sugar instead. Her calm demeanor seemed to frustrate Bradley. He thrived on reactions: anger, fear, submission. The fact that she wasn't giving him any of those things irked him. He took another sip of his coffee, loudly this time, and turned to look at her again. "What's the matter?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue?" She met his gaze then, her eyes steady and unwavering. For the first time, Bradley seemed slightly taken aback. There was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "I just don't think it's worth engaging with someone like you," she said simply. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was a sharp edge to her words that cut deeper than any insult could have. Bradley's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, though it was less confident now. "Someone like me," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the counter, took her coffee, and walked to an empty table by the window. She sat down, her back straight, and began stirring her coffee as if nothing had happened. The cafe buzzed back to life, but the incident lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Conversations resumed, though quieter now, and a few patrons exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Little did Bradley know, this wasn't just any woman. Officer Carter had a reputation in town. Everyone knew him, but not in the way people usually respect a police officer. His name brought unease rather than comfort. It wasn't because he was good at his job or because he kept the streets safe. No, Bradley Carter was infamous for his behavior, his arrogance, his sharp tongue, and the way he used his badge like a weapon to shield himself from consequences. He thrived on moments where he could assert his so-called authority, especially against people he thought couldn't fight back. He believed that the badge gave him power, but it was the way he wielded it, reckless and unchecked, that made people fear him. It wasn't respect he earned, it was avoidance. People knew better than to argue with him, knowing it would only make things worse. And today, in the cozy, bustling Millstone Cafe, Bradley was in his element. The warmth of the cafe, the hum of friendly chatter, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee were a sharp contrast to the tension he brought in with him. He was waiting for his coffee, leaning against the counter with a smug look on his face, surveying the room like he owned the place. His gaze fell on the woman again, the one who had dared to ask him to move earlier. She was quiet, sipping her coffee by the window, her posture calm and composed. She didn't seem the least bit rattled by his earlier behavior, and that annoyed him more than he cared to admit. "Look at her," he said loudly, turning to the barista. His voice carried across the room, drawing the attention of a few nearby customers. "Standing there like she's better than us." The barista didn't respond, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the counter. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and clearly nervous. She'd seen Officer Carter cause trouble before, and she knew it was best to stay quiet and not make eye contact. The woman didn't flinch at his words. She didn't turn her head or react in any way. Instead, she took another slow sip of her coffee, her eyes focused on something outside the window. Her calmness seemed deliberate, almost as if she was waiting for something. Her silence only fueled Bradley's need to provoke her. He thrived on reactions, and the fact that she wasn't giving him one felt like a challenge. He couldn't let it go. "You're awfully quiet," he said, stepping closer to her table. His tone was mocking, his smirk widening as he loomed over her. "Don't have anything to say, or is it just that you don't belong here?" The cafe grew quieter. The clinking of spoons and the chatter of customers slowly faded as people began to notice the scene unfolding. Eyes darted between Bradley and the woman, curiosity and unease spreading through the room. No one said anything, but their expressions spoke volumes. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how she would respond. The woman finally looked up. Her eyes met Bradley's, steady and unflinching. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet, almost unsettling confidence. For a brief moment, Bradley felt something he didn't recognize. It wasn't intimidation, not exactly, but there was a weight in her gaze that made his smirk falter for just a second. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, her expression calm and unreadable. Then, as if deciding he wasn't worth her time, she turned her attention back to her coffee. That simple act, her refusal to engage, felt like a slap in the face to Bradley. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not in public. His smirk returned, but it was forced now, masking his growing frustration. "Still nothing," he said, his voice louder this time, as if trying to draw more attention. "Come on, say something. Or is this how you people handle things? Silent treatment." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The barista froze mid-pour, her eyes darting toward the woman, silently pleading for her to say or do something to defuse the situation. But the woman didn't take the bait. She remained quiet, her composure unshaken. Her silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate, and it was powerful. It wasn't that she didn't have anything to say, it was that she chose not to say it. Her lack of reaction only made Bradley angrier. He thrived on conflict, on the power dynamics he created, and her refusal to play his game felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. "What's the matter?" he sneered, leaning closer to her table. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to speak up?" This time, she set her coffee cup down gently on the table. The small sound it made seemed louder than it should have, cutting through the tension in the room. She looked up at him again, her expression calm but firm. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice steady and measured. There was no trace of anger or fear, just a quiet authority that caught Bradley off guard. Her question wasn't rhetorical. It was direct, and it hit him harder than any insult could have. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. The smirk faded from his face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly. "I asked if you're finished," she repeated, her tone unchanged. "Because if you're not, I'd like to enjoy my coffee in peace." The room was silent now. Everyone was watching, holding their breath. The tension was thick, and even Bradley seemed unsure of how to proceed. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. She didn't wait for him to recover. She picked up her coffee cup again, took a slow sip, and turned her attention back to the window. It was as if he no longer existed in her world. For the first time, Bradley felt a flicker of doubt. He didn't know who this woman was, but there was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, that made him uneasy. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, and it gnawed at him as he stood there, unsure of what to do next. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, the barista spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "Officer Carter, maybe it's best to leave her alone." Her words broke the spell, snapping Bradley out of his thoughts. He turned to glare at the barista, but her timid expression softened his anger. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed his coffee and turned toward the door. As he walked out, the chatter in the cafe slowly resumed. People exchanged hushed whispers, their curiosity piqued. Who was this woman, they wondered, and how had she managed to stand her ground against Bradley Carter? Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning. The tension simmered in the air like a pot about to boil over. The woman remained composed, her movements deliberate and controlled as she reached for her coffee. The cafe was unusually quiet now, even the background noise of conversations had faded. Bradley Carter, emboldened by the lack of immediate challenge, decided he wasn't done. He stepped slightly closer, his large frame blocking her path. As she picked up her cup, he moved just enough to accidentally bump her arm. The motion seemed clumsy on purpose, the kind of calculated stumble designed to look unintentional but meant to cause chaos. The result was predictable: the coffee splashed out of the cup, some of it spilling onto her plain gray jacket. "Oops," Bradley said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. His smirk widened as he leaned back slightly, giving her just enough space to react. "Guess you shouldn't have been standing there." A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Heads turned, customers froze mid-sip or mid-sentence, and the barista's hand stopped mid-motion as she was about to place a new order on the counter. The woman didn't flinch. Her calmness was unnerving, almost as though the coffee stain on her jacket was the least of her concerns. Slowly, she reached for a napkin from the dispenser on the table and dabbed at the spot, her expression unreadable. Bradley crossed his arms, clearly expecting a more dramatic reaction. He thrived on confrontation and was disappointed when she didn't give it to him. "Apologize to her," someone muttered from a table nearby. The voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but it broke through the silence like a pebble dropped into still water. All eyes shifted to Bradley, waiting to see how he would respond. "Apologize," Bradley repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head as if the idea was too absurd to entertain. "To her? You've got to be kidding me." His laughter was harsh and hollow, filling the room with a sound that made several patrons wince. It was the kind of laugh meant to dismiss and diminish, to reinforce his perceived power in the situation. The woman finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were steady and unblinking, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and cool, but there was an edge to it that demanded attention. "Are you always this disrespectful to people you don't know?" she asked. Bradley's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. He wasn't expecting her to say anything at all, much less a direct question that turned the focus back on him. He quickly recovered, his laugh returning as a cover for his discomfort. "Lady, I don't need to know you to know what kind of person you are," he said, leaning in slightly as if to intimidate her. The woman's gaze hardened, but she didn't raise her voice or react defensively. Instead, she reached into her pocket, her movements slow and deliberate. Bradley's smirk widened again, but it was clear he was trying to mask his unease. "What, you gonna call someone?" "Good luck with that," he said, his tone mocking. When her hand emerged, it wasn't holding a phone. Instead, she held a small, sleek badge. She placed it on the table in front of her with a calmness that sent a ripple of shock through the cafe. The room fell silent. The badge gleamed under the cafe's soft lights, its bold letters clearly visible to anyone close enough to read them. "Chief of Police." The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight pressing down on Bradley like a physical force. His laughter stopped cold. His face went pale, the confidence draining from his expression like water from a punctured bucket. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're Chief Dawson." The woman nodded once, her expression as calm as ever. "Yes, Officer Carter," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "And I think we need to have a conversation about your behavior not just today, but in general." Gasps and whispers spread through the cafe like wildfire. Patrons who had previously kept their heads down now stared openly, some with wide-eyed shock and others with satisfied smirks. The barista's hand went to her mouth, her eyes darting between Bradley and the woman as if she couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Bradley took a step back, his hands trembling slightly. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Oh, I'm very serious, Chief Dawson replied, standing up slowly. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, each one emphasizing her authority. She took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. And I suggest you think carefully about your next words. They may determine whether you keep that badge of yours. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a stammering attempt at damage control. I didn't know. I mean, I wasn't trying to. Save it, Chief Dawson said, cutting him off. Her tone was sharp but calm, her authority undeniable. We'll discuss this back at the station. The cafe was silent, every patron holding their breath as the scene unfolded. Bradley looked around, his eyes darting from face to face as if searching for an ally. But no one came to his aid. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Yes, ma'am, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Dawson nodded once, her expression unreadable. Good. Now leave. Bradley didn't need to be told twice. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps quick and unsteady. As he pushed it open and stepped outside, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively, the tension in the room finally breaking. A few patrons clapped quietly, their applause hesitant but genuine. The barista let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and offered Chief Dawson a small, grateful smile. Chief Dawson returned to her seat, picked up her coffee, and sipped it as if nothing had happened. The room slowly returned to normal, though the whispers and glances in her direction continued. For the patrons of Millstone Cafe, this was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. The room froze, as if time itself had come to a halt. The sleek badge in the woman's hand seemed to shine brighter under the cafe's warm lights, the bold words Chief of Police etched clearly for everyone to see. A ripple of recognition spread through the crowd, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Bradley Carter's expression was a mix of disbelief and growing panic. The confidence that had radiated from him earlier vanished, replaced by a pale, almost ghostly complexion. His lips moved, but no coherent words came out. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Wait, you're Chief Dawson." The woman nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching and steady. "Yes, Officer Carter," she said, her voice low and firm. "And I think we need to have a conversation about your behavior not just today, but in general." A murmur spread through the cafe, whispers barely contained as the patrons processed what they had just witnessed. For the first time, the smug officer who had strutted around moments ago was visibly shaken. You can't be serious," Bradley muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. He took a small step back, his usual swagger nowhere to be seen. "Oh, I'm very serious," Chief Dawson said, stepping closer to him. Each step was measured, deliberate, and filled with purpose. She wasn't loud, nor did she need to be. The quiet authority in her tone was more powerful than any shout. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. They may determine whether you keep that badge." The cafe was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every pair of eyes was on them, the once dominant Bradley now looking small and uncertain under Chief Dawson's unwavering gaze. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, searching for an excuse, an explanation, anything to salvage the situation. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as just another nobody. And now, he was paying the price for his arrogance. Finally, he managed to stammer, I didn't know it was you. I didn't mean." "That's obvious," she interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "Because if you had known, would you have acted any differently? Or does your behavior change based on who you think is worth respecting?" The words hit him like a slap. His mouth opened and closed as he tried to respond, but he had nothing to say. The whispers in the cafe grew louder, the patrons no longer hiding their curiosity. Some exchanged amused glances, others whispered about the poetic justice of the scene unfolding before them. The barista, who had been standing frozen behind the counter, finally let out a small, audible sigh of relief. Her eyes darted between Bradley and Chief Dawson, a mixture of fear and admiration evident on her face. Chief Dawson turned to the barista, her voice softening slightly. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," she said. "You've been very patient." The barista blinked in surprise, then nodded quickly. "Thank you, Chief," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bradley's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He clenched his fists at his sides, the realization of his position sinking in. "Look," he said, his voice shaky, "it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to." "No, Officer Carter," Chief Dawson said firmly, cutting him off. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate display of disrespect and arrogance. And unfortunately for you, this isn't the first time I've heard complaints about your behavior." The room fell silent again. Bradley's eyes widened in shock, his lips forming the beginning of a protest, but he stopped himself. "Do you think your badge gives you the right to treat people this way?" Chief Dawson continued, her voice steady but pointed. "Do you think the uniform makes you untouchable?" He shook his head quickly, his bravado completely gone. "No, ma'am. I mean, no, Chief. I didn't mean any harm." "Didn't you?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Because from where I'm standing, it looked like you enjoyed trying to humiliate someone you assumed had no power to stand up to you." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He didn't know where to look. Her intense gaze made him feel as though she could see straight through him. "Let me make one thing very clear," Chief Dawson said, stepping even closer. "Your behavior reflects not just on you, but on this department and on me. And I won't tolerate it, not today, not ever." Her words carried a finality that left no room for argument. Bradley nodded mutely, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his humiliation. "I'll be filing a formal report about this incident," Chief Dawson continued. "And you can expect a meeting with me and Internal Affairs very soon." "Yes, ma'am," Bradley mumbled, his voice barely audible. Satisfied, Chief Dawson turned her attention back to the room. Her gaze swept over the patrons, many of whom quickly averted their eyes, not wanting to be caught staring. "To everyone here," she said, her voice loud enough to carry but still calm, "I apologize for the disruption. This isn't the example of professionalism or respect I expect from my officers." The barista was the first to respond, her voice timid but sincere. "Thank you, Chief," she said. Chief Dawson nodded at her before returning her attention to Bradley. "Now, I suggest you leave. I'll see you at the station." Bradley didn't need to be told twice. He turned quickly, almost stumbling over his own feet as he made his way to the door. The cafe was silent as he pushed it open and stepped outside. As the door swung shut behind him, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had hung heavy in the air dissipated, replaced by a mixture of relief and satisfaction. A few patrons clapped quietly, the sound hesitant at first but growing louder as others joined in. Chief Dawson didn't acknowledge the applause, she simply returned to her seat, picked up her coffee, and took a sip as if nothing had happened. For the people in the cafe, this moment would become a story they told for years to come, a story of justice, humility, and the day Bradley Carter finally met his match. But for Chief Dawson, it was just another day on the job. By the time Chief Dawson left the cafe, the events of the morning were already beginning to ripple through the small town. Word traveled fast in communities like theirs, and it didn't take long for the news of Officer Bradley Carter's humiliation and pending suspension to spread like wildfire. At first, people couldn't believe it. Bradley had long been a symbol of unchecked power, a man who seemed untouchable despite his countless offenses. But now, the story of his public dressing down by none other than the new chief of police gave hope to many who had suffered silently under his abuse of authority. For years, Bradley had built his reputation on intimidation and arrogance. He wasn't just rude, he was reckless, often using his badge as a shield for his behavior. From traffic stops that turned unnecessarily hostile to condescending remarks thrown at those he deemed beneath him, his actions had left a trail of resentment. People whispered about him in hushed tones, but no one had ever dared to challenge him outright until now. As news of his suspension circulated, the reactions were swift and varied. Some residents, particularly those who had been directly wronged by Bradley, felt a sense of vindication. Maria, the owner of a small bakery on the edge of town, had once been brought to tears when Bradley had stormed into her shop over a parking dispute. He had belittled her in front of her customers, accusing her of breaking laws she hadn't even understood. Hearing about his fall from grace brought her a kind of relief she hadn't thought possible. "I never thought I'd see the day," Maria said to a friend as they sipped tea in her shop. Someone finally put him in his place. Others, particularly those who had once defended Bradley, were more cautious in their reactions. Some officers within the department had seen him as a tough but effective enforcer of the law. To them, his suspension felt like a blow to their tightly knit fraternity. "I don't know," muttered Officer Jenkins, one of Bradley's colleagues, as he spoke to a group of officers in the break room. "Sure, he was rough around the edges, but this feels harsh." Another officer, a young recruit named Emily, shook her head. "Harsh," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You think holding him accountable is harsh? He humiliated people, Jenkins. He made people afraid of us not because they were guilty of anything, but because they didn't know how far he'd go." Jenkins didn't respond, but the room fell silent. Emily's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the culture that had allowed Bradley to thrive for so long. Meanwhile, Chief Dawson wasted no time in turning her attention to the larger issues within the department. She didn't bask in the attention her actions had garnered. Instead, she treated the incident as a stepping stone for much-needed change. Her first move was to call a meeting with her officers. She wanted to address the culture that had allowed someone like Bradley Carter to wield his power unchecked. The conference room was packed, the tension palpable as officers filed in, many unsure of what to expect. Chief Dawson stood at the head of the room, her posture straight and her expression calm but firm. "Let me make something clear," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "What happened today at the cafe wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about the values we uphold as a department and as individuals. And I won't tolerate disrespect, arrogance, or abuse of power from anyone wearing this badge." Her words were met with a mixture of reactions. Some nodded in agreement, their respect for her growing. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their loyalty to the old ways making them defensive. "This badge," she continued, holding up her own for emphasis, "is not a free pass to do whatever you please. It's a symbol of responsibility, of service, and of trust. If you're not willing to uphold those values, then this is not the place for you." Emily, the young recruit, felt a surge of pride as she listened. For the first time, she felt that she was part of a team that valued integrity over blind loyalty. As Chief Dawson worked on reforming the department, Bradley Carter's suspension became a hot topic across town. His downfall was more than just gossip, it was a lesson in accountability, one that resonated far beyond the walls of the police station. For Bradley, the suspension was a wake-up call he hadn't seen coming. Stripped of his badge and gun, he found himself facing a harsh reality. The respect he once commanded through intimidation had vanished, replaced by whispers and sideways glances. He avoided the main streets of town, knowing that his presence would only draw stares. The cafe incident had been talked about in every corner of the community, from the grocery store to the school playground. Parents told their children about it as a reminder that no one was above the rules, not even those who enforced them. For weeks, Bradley sat alone in his small apartment, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. He hadn't just lost his badge, he'd lost his identity. For the first time, he was forced to confront the person he had become. With Bradley gone, a sense of relief swept through the town. People felt safer, freer to go about their lives without the shadow of his presence looming over them. Maria, the bakery owner, noticed an immediate difference. Customers who had once hurried out of her shop when Bradley entered now lingered longer, chatting and enjoying their coffee. "It's like a weight has been lifted," she told her husband one evening. Even the cafe where the incident had taken place saw a change. The barista, who had once dreaded Bradley's visits, now served customers with a newfound confidence. "It feels good to know that someone finally stood up to him," she said. As time went on, Bradley Carter's name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. Parents used his story to teach their children about humility and respect. Teachers discussed it in classrooms as an example of accountability. For Chief Dawson, the incident was a catalyst for lasting change. Under her leadership, the department began implementing regular training sessions focused on ethics and community engagement. Complaints were taken more seriously, and officers were encouraged to build trust with the people they served. Slowly but surely, the relationship between the police and the community began to heal. Chief Dawson didn't see herself as a hero. To her, standing up to Bradley Carter was just part of the job. But to the people of the town, she was a symbol of hope, a leader who wasn't afraid to do what was right, even when it was difficult. Her actions reminded everyone that true power comes not from dominance, but from respect. And as the town moved forward, they carried that lesson with them, determined to build a community where arrogance and prejudice had no place. Bradley Carter's story might have ended in disgrace, but for the town, it marked the beginning of a brighter future. Sometimes, the strongest justice comes not from shouting or fighting back but from standing firm and letting the truth speak for itself. That truth echoed throughout the small town in the days, weeks, and months following the cafe incident. Chief Dawson's calm yet commanding approach left a lasting impression on everyone who heard about it. Her actions taught people a lesson that went far beyond the walls of the police department: strength isn't always loud, and respect is earned through action, not force. The power of quiet strength. For years, people in the town had grown used to seeing authority abused. Bradley Carter had been a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power, arrogance, entitlement, and the belief that a badge placed him above others. His downfall was more than just a victory for those he had wronged, it was a testament to the power of integrity. Chief Dawson didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't demand respect. She simply stood her ground, spoke the truth, and let her actions reveal the authority she carried. It wasn't about proving who was stronger, it was about proving what was right. Her quiet strength resonated with the people of the town. It showed them that justice doesn't need to be loud or flashy. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is to refuse to stoop to someone else's level. The cafe became a symbol of change, a place where something significant had happened. Patrons who visited the cafe after the incident often commented on the new atmosphere. The tension that had once filled the air during Bradley's frequent visits was gone, replaced by a sense of safety and belonging. For the barista who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, the lesson was deeply personal. She had always believed that standing up to someone like Bradley was impossible. Watching Chief Dawson handle the situation with such poise gave her a new sense of confidence. "I never thought anyone could hold him accountable," she told a regular customer one afternoon. "But she showed me that you don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to believe in what's right and not back down." That sentiment spread through the town like wildfire. Parents began telling their children the story of the new chief of police who stood up to the arrogant officer. Teachers used it as an example in their lessons on fairness and responsibility. The story became a reminder that no one is above the rules, not even those who enforce them. For Chief Dawson, the incident at the cafe was just one moment in her long career, but it was a defining one. It reinforced her belief that leadership isn't about control, it's about service. She knew that her position came with responsibility, not privilege, and she carried that understanding into every decision she made. As the weeks went by, Chief Dawson implemented new policies within the department. She introduced mandatory training sessions on ethics and community engagement, ensuring that every officer understood the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. She also established an anonymous reporting system, encouraging both officers and community members to speak up about misconduct without fear of retaliation. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Complaints against the police department decreased, and trust between the officers and the community slowly began to rebuild. People who had once viewed the police with suspicion started to see them as allies again. "She's the kind of leader we've needed for a long time," said Emily, the young recruit who had watched the cafe incident unfold. "She doesn't just talk about change, she makes it happen." For Bradley Carter, the aftermath of the cafe incident was a time of painful reflection. Stripped of his badge and suspended from duty, he found himself grappling with questions he had avoided for years. Who was he without his badge? What kind of person had he become? At first, he was angry at Chief Dawson, at the town, and even at himself. But as the days turned into weeks, that anger began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the damage he had caused. He started to see the hurt in the eyes of the people he had wronged, the fear he had instilled in those he was supposed to protect. For the first time in years, Bradley began to question his choices. He enrolled in counseling, hoping to address the underlying issues that had driven his behavior. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. "I let the badge go to my head," he admitted to a friend one day. "I thought it made me better than everyone else. But now I see that it was never about the badge. It was about the person wearing it." The cafe incident didn't just change Bradley or the police department, it changed the entire town. It reminded people of the power of accountability and the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. Local organizations began hosting community events to foster better relationships between the police and the residents. Discussions about fairness, respect, and equality became more common, both in schools and in town meetings. The story of Chief Dawson's quiet but firm stand became a rallying cry for those who believed in justice. "She didn't have to raise her voice," said Maria, the bakery owner who had once been humiliated by Bradley. "She didn't have to demand respect. She just stood there and let the truth speak for itself. That's real power." As time went on, Chief Dawson's actions became a defining part of her legacy. People admired her not just for her ability to lead, but for the way she treated everyone with fairness and dignity. She showed them that true authority doesn't come from a badge or a title, it comes from the way you carry yourself and the respect you show to others. Her story inspired people far beyond the small town. Other police departments began reaching out to learn from her policies, and community leaders sought her advice on how to build trust between officers and residents. She became a symbol of what leadership should look like: firm, fair, and focused on service. Sometimes, the strongest justice comes not from shouting or fighting back but from standing firm and letting the truth speak for itself. Chief Dawson's actions that day at the cafe proved that lesson in the most powerful way possible. The town moved forward, but the memory of that day remained. It was a reminder that change is always possible, that arrogance and prejudice have no place in positions of power, and that true authority doesn't need to announce itself, it simply is. And as the people of the town carried that lesson with them, they worked together to build a community where respect, kindness, and accountability were more than just ideals, they were the foundation of everything they did.